Hi guys, it's your science teacher here, back with another video. This time it is all on B11, which is hormonal coordination. In this topic, we will go through different hormones in the body. We will specifically look at diabetes and ways of treating diabetes, and we will also get into some plant hormones. So without further ado, let's get started with today's video. The topic of hormonal coordination starts off by looking at what hormones actually are and where in the body we can produce them. So, what actually is a hormone? A hormone is a chemical in the body that can cause a change in your cells. Hormones are different from the nervous system in the fact that they are often longer lasting and the response often takes longer to come into play. For example, think about adrenaline, for example. If you've just been on a roller coaster, sometimes it takes you a while to cool down after being on such an intense ride. But where in the body are these hormones made? Well, hormones come from glands in the body, and the different glands make up what is called the endocrine system. Now, you can see that on this screen, I have two dummies with all of the glands that you need to know for your GCSE shown. The reason why I have a biologically male one and a biological female one is because of the fact that some of the glands start to become a bit different as we look at reproductive glands. If we start by looking at this big gland in our brain, that is known as the hypothalamus. And that is responsible for controlling many processes in homeostasis, such as body temperature. Without the hypothalamus, we would not be able to keep our body temperature at a steady rate. Underneath the hypothalamus, we have the pituitary gland, also known as the master gland. It is actually the smaller one in our brain. And the reason why the pituitary gland is known as the master gland is because of the fact it produces so many different hormones. And one of the main hormones that it controls is when we enter puberty, and also it controls our growth. Next up, we have this butterfly shaped gland known as the thyroid gland, situated in our necks, and the thyroid gland is useful in controlling our metabolism. Basically, it controls the rate at which we take in calories. Next gland we're going to look at is just above the pancreas. These are the adrenal glands. We have one either side, and that obviously produces the hormone adrenaline, and that kind of inhibits that flight or fight response. It makes you increase your heart rate so that you're ready for any scenario. And below the adrenal gland, we have the pancreas, and the pancreas is, of course, in charge of controlling blood sugar levels. And it produces that hormone insulin, and we'll look at that in a bit more depth. Now, I said that there was different reproductive glands on biological males and biological females, so let's look at that now. In the biological female, they have the ovaries, and the ovaries produce that hormone called estrogen, and estrogen plays a large part in the menstrual cycle, as we will find out. And on the biological male, they have the testes, which produce the hormone testosterone. Hormones work on the principle of a negative feedback loop. And what a negative feedback loop basically is your body will detect whether you have too high or too low levels in your body. Maybe that's blood glucose level, maybe it's temperature. And what happens is your receptor will detect a change. It's something that's changed in the environment, and therefore a response needs to be given. and that response is in the shape of a hormone, and the response can lower or raise that level. So for example, if your blood glucose is too low, your response will then have to raise the blood glucose level until we get to that ideal level known as homeostasis. This is the control of all of our internal environment. And that's what this word homeostasis means. Now, let's look at a negative feedback loop in a bit more detail. And I said that we'd look at this one at the start of the video. It is blood glucose levels. Now, what happens if those blood glucose levels in our body get too high? Well, our bodies release a hormone called insulin, and that is released from the pancreas. Now, what happens when our body has released this hormone? What response do we get in our body? Well, our blood glucose level is obviously going to lower, but how does that happen? Well, our cells start taking in the glucose from the bloodstream. And there is another response as well. Some of this glucose is stored in the liver as glycogen. Now, what happens if our blood glucose levels fall too low? Well, if our glucose is too low, our pancreas is so clever it can release another hormone. And this time it will release glucagon. Now, what this glucagon does is it will turn that stored glycogen back into glucose, and it will also tell our cells to start releasing some of the glucose that has been stored. Now, I understand in this topic there is some words that look a bit similar: glucose, glycogen, and glucagon. And I understand that it's sometimes quite difficult to remember them. So remember just to keep practicing with questions that involve the three, and you will eventually learn them. Now, we're going to look at a condition now that occurs when we struggle controlling our blood glucose level, and that condition is known as diabetes. Now, there are two types of diabetes. The first one is called type 1 diabetes because we are inventive as scientists. And type 1 diabetes is a condition that we are often born with. And basically, it results because of the fact our pancreas doesn't produce enough insulin. Now, if our pancreas doesn't produce enough insulin, that usually means that we have quite a high blood glucose level. And this can result in people feeling a bit dizzy, feeling sick, needing to wee a lot. So it's very unpleasant. And the way we treat type 1 diabetes is often by insulin shots. This just means that you get injected with this hormone so that you can control your blood glucose level and lower it. Now, type 2 diabetes is a bit different as you are often not born with type 2 diabetes. It develops over time, and it can result from a few things. It can often result from obesity and a high sugar diet. Now, once you have type 2 diabetes, how do we treat this and why does it result from this high sugar diet? Well, basically what happens is your pancreas stops responding to insulin. So how can we treat this? If we cannot treat this with simply just insulin shots because our body's not responding to it, we need to control our diet and exercise. And these are ways that we can control type 2 diabetes so our blood glucose levels don't get too high. We're now going to look at a different hormone controlled cycle known as the menstrual cycle. And the menstrual cycle is a very important cycle for biological females, as that is the cycle which controls how humans can reproduce, humans and other animals can reproduce. Now, in days 1 to 7, this is when menstruation occurs. And menstruation just means bleeding. And in terms of hormones, they are all pretty much at a steady level here. Now, as we go to day 8 and bleeding starts to stop from days 8 to 13, you will notice one of the hormones starts to increase in its level, and that is estrogen. And what this estrogen increase level does is it starts to build up the lining in the uterus. If we now look at day 14, an important process starts to take place called ovulation. And this basically is caused by two key hormones. FSH, known as the follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, known as the luteinizing hormone. What happens in this stage is the follicle stimulating hormone causes an egg to mature. And the luteinizing hormone causes an egg to be released. Now, between these days of 14 to 20, this is when a woman is most fertile. This is the time where you're most likely to become pregnant. But it's also important to remember that sperm can last for 2 days inside the ovary, so you can get pregnant having sex even earlier than ovulation. The next key hormone buildup happens around day 22 to day 23, and this is when progesterone is released. And progesterone basically it keeps the lining of the uterus thick. And the reason why it does this is because of the fact that if a egg gets fertilized, it has somewhere to implant. However, if you do not become pregnant and the progesterone levels do start falling, because if you are fertilized, progesterone stays, you start producing more and more progesterone to keep that lining thick so that you do not menstruate. However, if that progesterone level does start to fall again, you will start the cycle all over again at day number 1, and the cycle will repeat again. Now, it's not everyone's wish to become pregnated, and there are ways that we can stop people from becoming pregnant, and those methods are called contraceptives. We can split contraceptives into two main categories. We have chemical methods of contraception, and we also have barrier methods of contraception. Let's firstly look at these barrier methods of contraception, and these basically work on a principle of not letting the sperm reach the egg. And let's first look at condoms. And it's important to remember there are two types of condoms, ones that can be placed onto a male's penis and one that can be inserted inside a female's vagina. And you can also get a rubber cap which can be inserted into a vagina, and therefore it stops the sperm from basically going past the vagina, through the uterus and into the fallopian tubes. Now, it's important to remember with these barrier methods, you often get no side effects. And that is a reason why condoms are often so popular, is because of the fact they do not produce any hormonal side effects, and also the fact that they can prevent STDs. This basically means that you cannot get sexually transmitted diseases. If you wear a condom correctly, you're unlikely to pass on STDs such as gonorrhea and HIV. But just like with any contraceptive, these aren't 100%. This means that sometimes they might not be working, maybe they're faulty, and some sperm can get through and you can become pregnant. It's also important to remember none of these contraceptives are 100%. Let's now look at some chemical methods of contraception, and let's first look at the pill. And I have a picture of the pill in the bottom corner of the screen, and the pill basically works by controlling hormone levels. They often contain estrogen and progesterone, and because they they contain this, it stops the release of FSH, and therefore an egg doesn't mature. But the pill does come with some side effects. For example, if you miss a day on the pill, sometimes FSH can be released and a spontaneous egg can be released into the system and you can become pregnant. Also, the fact the pill can mess with your hormone balance, and that cannot be perfect. And in some cases, the pill has caused blood clots. But there is other chemical methods of contraception. An example is spermicidal gel. Spermicidal gel basically has the role of killing sperm when it enters the vagina. Another chemical contraceptive is the coil, or sometimes called an IUD. And what an IUD does, basically, it releases progesterone really slowly, which causes that uterus lining to stay thick. It's also important to remember you can avoid using these contraceptives if you abstain from having sex as well. So abstinence is another type of method to control the not getting pregnant. However, if you do want to become pregnant, we can now also use hormones to facilitate that as well. And this way is known as IVF, or in vitro fertilization. And this basically means fertilization that happens outside of the body. And the way that in vitro fertilization works is by taking a couple who may be having difficulties conceiving a baby by sexual intercourse. And what happens is the mother is supplied with hormones containing luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormones, and these eggs are collected. Once these eggs have been collected, what can happen is you can combine them with the male sperm. And this is obviously called fertilization. Once the egg has been fertilized, this can be implanted into the woman's uterus. And once an egg has become fertilized, we call it a zygote. And during this stage, there is also some hormone injections, such as progesterone, to make sure the lining of the uterus is thick enough so that the zygote will implant. Now, IVF is quite a controversial topic of discussion because of the fact it involves artificially producing zygotes, and this is a bit controversial. It obviously has the advantages of allowing people who couldn't usually have a baby to have babies. For example, same-sex couples can use IVF, and also we can use IVF for people who cannot biologically produce offspring by themselves and just need a little bit more extra help. However, it does have disadvantages. For example, it's not 100% successful. Some zygotes, unfortunately, will not implant. With all the chemicals in the world, it just won't happen. And also, there's the ethical issues of some religions will not accept the idea of IVF because it's not natural, and there's people opposing it because when does a zygote become a living being, and is it fair? So there is these ethical concerns around this topic. Plants also contain hormones, it's important to remember, and the hormone that we're going to look at in plants to start with is the hormone called auxins. And these are the growth hormones in plants. You have probably noticed with plants, especially plants such as sunflowers, that they will grow towards the light. And this is a process known as phototropism. Here I've drawn the sun, and the sun is shining onto this stem of a plant. And what has happened with these growth hormones, these auxins, is they've all gathered at the side furthest away from the light. This causes this side of the plant to grow faster, as the auxins are growth hormones, and this causes the plant to bend towards the light. And this process is known as phototropism. Now, there is another example of tropism as well, which happens in the roots, and this form of tropism is known as gravitropism. And this basically is what happens in the roots, and this causes the roots to grow away from the light. And what happens is the auxins basically gather on the side furthest away from the light, and therefore it causes growth downwards. So it happens in the roots. Now, farmers have actually started to take advantage of plant hormones in order to maximize yields and in order to get the best crops. So one way they can do that is by utilizing auxins. Obviously, auxins help plants grow quicker, so you can use auxins in fertilizers in order to maximize the size and the speed in which the plant grows. And auxins are actually used in weed killers. And how the weed killers work is they cause the weed to grow so quick that it cannot take up enough minerals and water, and in fact it actually kills it by growing. I know that sounds a bit weird, but that's how weed killers actually work. Some different fertilizers that farmers use are gibberellines. And what gibberellines do is they cause seeds to germinate quicker. Obviously, if the seed germinates quicker, then you can grow more crop, and you can also make sure that it's grown quicker. So you can replant other things in that field later down the line. Another example of a hormone that farmers will use is ethene. And ethene is often used with bananas, and the reason why it's used in bananas is to cause them to ripen. Bananas are often picked off trees green, and we need to ripen them up so they're yellow for the shops. So they are put in the packet with ethene. And this basically causes them to ripen more quickly and become edible faster. This is why you shouldn't put your bananas in your fruit bowl with other pieces of fruit, as it will cause the other fruit to go off quicker. Alright, that is all for today's video. I hope you have enjoyed it. Remember, if you did, to drop it a like and subscribe to the channel.